Let me just go ahead and get started. Christine was nice enough to send me her notes. I knew she was in a little bit of pain and on meds because not only did she attach the document one time, but it was attached 29 times in the same email. So I hope she didn't type these up during that same thought process. So let me go ahead and just read what she wrote about the goal of this, and I'll give you my interpretation. And I have talked to her since then. The goal of this panel is to engage standard setters and academics in a frank and open, her phrase, discussion about how academics' research can best inform the standard setting process. Now, Christine is well known at the board table for saying words matter. And she'll say that over and over. And it's usually when she's not getting her way on a particular vote. So I figured that she meant frank and open as it's interpreted in Washington. If you ever listen to news conferences or meetings, you get phrases like, if the meeting went well, it was constructive. If it went okay, but you didn't accomplish anything, it was cordial. Frank and open is saved for those meetings that didn't go particularly well. And I'm quite familiar with those, and you'll see on the panel next about CECL and credit losses. I've had a lot of the frank and open type in the last year or so, but I'll save that for later. But I guess in listening to Peter's opening comments, what I heard the word provocative. I also heard it from Paul when I was talking to him this morning. Christine apparently left some instructions for the panel. Be provocative. So you may not agree with everything that's said, but this is your opportunity to push back as well. And we're going to give a good bit of time after some opening comments for you all to ask questions and push back on anything that's provocative. And hopefully it'll turn into a really good panel and session. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to each of the individuals. I'm going to start with Paul, and we're just going to go straight down the line. I've asked them to go ahead and give a couple comments about themselves, and particularly their experiences as it relates to today's topic, and then any other comments that they want to make for opening.
So, do you want to do background first and then go back?
No, just go background and then your opening comments.
Okay. Hi, my name's Paul Beswick. I started in public accounting in 1994. Back in the Pittsburgh office of Ernst & Young. I spent 11 years as a practitioner in the field auditing large public companies. I then was fortunate enough to spend 2 years at the FASB as a FASB practice fellow. So I relocated my wife, who at the time was 7 months pregnant, from her hometown of Cincinnati, Ohio, which she had never left, to Connecticut. And there's some funny stories about transition. Moved her up to Connecticut for 2.5 years, and then I took a job at the SEC as senior advisor to the chief accountant. And what I thought was going to be a 2-year time at the SEC turned into 7 years through the financial crisis. And so I learned a lot more than I had ever anticipated and saw quite a number of rulemakings, including Dodd-Frank, which was passed in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And after 7 years at the SEC in various roles, senior advisor, 2 different deputy roles, and the chief accountant role, I left. I took 6 months off as a sabbatical, which, up until that point, I had never understood why people needed sabbaticals. Having taken the 6 month off, I get it. So if you ever have the option to take a 6 month sabbatical, highly recommend it. And for the last 4 years, I've been back at Ernst & Young in a professional practice role. I do a lot with the standard setters, the regulators. I'm also involved in IFRS. I also do accounting consultations, and so pretty much the gamut. So a couple points I wanted to make from the beginning, and Christine, as a good moderator, gave us all the same charge. Every moderator I've ever known says you need to be provocative. You need to be, really engage with the audience. And so I came up with 5 items that I personally thought were rather provocative. I then called a couple of my friends in the academic community and found out that, well, except for one, these are not overly provocative, but maybe this group will be more inclined to... Or naive, I don't know, one of the two. So, first, if I think about academic research and regulation, and I think about all of my experiences in regulation and how we've utilized academics and academic research. The first point I'd make is, excuse me, I think academics could do a better job of asking questions that are relevant to the real world and not theoretical questions. And we'll talk about how to do that and why to do that, but that would be one. Two, you need to understand that accounting and financial reporting is not a physical science or a social science, but rather a communication vehicle between the company and their investors. I point that out because if you go back to the founding of the FASB, the founding of the FASB was based on the Wheat Commission. And it was a group of esteemed individuals who were in the financial reporting. And they said one of the problems with the predecessor of the FASB is they were too theoretical, that the FASB needed to be focused on practical answers that people could implement. And so I've always been sort of struck by that notion. Three, clarity of writing. So I view myself as, I'll say, a reasonably intelligent individual. And when I worked at OCA, I felt like I was surrounded by some of the best and the brightest. We used to have a monthly meeting. I don't know, it was more on the audit side, but we used to have a monthly meeting where the academic would take all of the academic literature that came out and explain it to us. Because as a practitioner, it was hard for us to understand a lot of the terminology that was used and a lot of the approaches that academics use to do research. And we as accountants have similar problems. We sometimes struggle to communicate what accounting does and why it does it, and so we suffer from, I would say, the same problem. Three, timeliness of what you do. That is something that from a practitioner is, and we can talk about what the barriers are, but becoming more timely with your research, as instead of publishing research 10 years after the relevant regulatory decision's been made, having the research being able to be done during the decision-making process would be incredibly helpful. And finally, this is probably the one that's a bit provocative. I think the academic community needs to view practitioners in the profession as an ally as opposed to the enemy. There seems to be at times a view that practitioners and the audit profession aren't focused on the right things or don't have the right intentions. Having been a practitioner and at a large firm, I think nothing's further from the truth. And I think we have a shared goal, and that is to improve financial reporting. It is to improve the pipeline that exists of accounting students. And so I just think we could do a lot more by working together as opposed to being as adversarial as we are at times.
Sagar?
Thanks, Hal. My name is Sagar Tiotia. It's good to be here. I'm the Deputy Chief Accountant in the Office of the Chief Accountant at the SEC. Before I forget, the most important part, my disclaimer. So these are my words, not the words of the Commission, any of the commissioners, or anybody else in OCA. So look forward to being here. As Paul mentioned, I think the tone of, I think we all have the same interest, trying to get the best numbers to investors at heart. And so we've had a long-standing practice of valuing the academic community. We've had academic fellows, a long history of terrific fellows, some of which are in this room, and a terrific program, as Paul mentioned. We have different meetings internally with academics. We also have a PhD that we've hired kind of full-time. So unlike the academic fellow, which turns, and she's been absolutely terrific. She's helped on speeches. Many of you may know her, Ying Compton, who I think has been a terrific hire for us, and we've learned a lot for her. Let me just describe OCA a little bit and what's important to us, because that might help inform kind of how you think through it as we enter into this engagement today. So sometimes when people think of the SEC, they picture that it's going to be some gigantic building with a bazillion people, right? All these things we regulate. The building is small, as you know. The first time I went there, I said, "Where's the rest of it?" It's only 10 floors. There's 4,500 people. Now there's contractors, so the 4,500 is a little bit misleading, but the point is it's not a bazillion people. So in OCA, we have 49 people. I told you about a couple of them, the academic fellow and Ying. So 2 out of 49 kind of straight in the heart of academia, kind of, would show the importance of it. So we're broken into 3 groups. The accounting group is the biggest group, probably about half of the group. That's the group I have the privilege of overseeing. I'll walk through in a second kind of what we're focused on and how we can link that. Then there's the professional practice group, which is about a third of the group. They directly oversee the PCOB. And then we have the international group, which I'll talk about in a second. So those are the 3 that kind of make the Office of the Chief Accountant. So as I sit back and think about in the accounting group what we're focused on and where research can be critical and we try to use is one, foundational to what we do is the FASB oversight. We statutorily have responsibility for the accounting standards. We've delegated it longstanding to the FASB. There's not a day that doesn't go by where we're not talking to Hal or somebody on his team. Absolutely critical to what we do. Accounting consultations, answering the questions. So these are the hardest of hard questions that sometimes come from Paul's firm or come from preparers, et cetera. Particularly in difficult areas like the new revenue standard, the leasing standard, the new credit law standard, and then challenging areas that exist like debt equity and derivatives. So we have to have a lot of expertise in order to get those questions right. Those questions are always material, always very meaningful to companies and so forth. So those are kind of the core foundation of what the accounting group does. So it's been a lot of work on the new standards and how to best implement those. Frankly speaking, you get this time to get the implementation as best as possible, and we've tried to take advantage of that. As I bounce around kind of the other offices, the professional practices group, like I said, has direct oversight of the PCOB. So foundational to what they're doing is working with the PCOB board, which, as folks know here, turned a year ago. They work on a daily basis with the new board, worked on the strategic plan with the PCOB. There's the ARM implementation that's going on. There's estimates and specialists which are going on. And so that's where they've been spending the brunt of their time. And then to round out international, which is very key in the work we've done, we have responsibility on the monitoring board, which is the oversight of the IASB. And then the monitoring group, which is the oversight, again, of the international auditing standards. And no doubt we're mindful of what's happening in the UK and then China and all these different kind of events. It's kind of the work of the international. So I wanted to give you a little lens of kind of what we're doing, how the 48 of us stay busy, how we try to do what our mission is, which is to protect investors, and look forward to today talking about kind of the academic portion of what we do, and then hearing what you do and trying to improve what we all do together.
So I'm Margot Cella. I'm the Senior Director for Research at the Center for Audit Quality, and I'm suffering a little bit from imposter syndrome here because I am neither a regulator nor an academic. But I do, in my role at the CAQ, oversee 2 different programs, but more importantly, that provide grants to academics for research and auditing. But more importantly, I work with what we refer to as our Research Advisory Board, which is populated by national partners from 7 of our 8 governing board firms, as well as 4 academics, or what we call non-practitioners, because one of them is Jeanette Franzel, and she's not an academic, but a avid consumer of academic research. Through our activities with the RAB, we try to encourage academics to do research that is relevant to audit. Every year we have an RFP process. We list out areas of interest for the profession, but it is very much a bottom-up process, so we don't say, this is the question we would like answered. We let the academics say, oh, you want something on fair value, here's a research project that I think is of interest. In the 11 years, we just have awarded 44 grants, and of those 44, 16 have made it into journals. The challenge I think that we have had in the past is that many of the proposals that we get in are really not grounded in practice. It becomes clear as we're reading through the proposal that oftentimes the academic does not know how something really happens in audit. So several years ago, we made the concerted effort to get more engaged with the academics. So if the research question was interesting, but the approach was a little bit off in terms of what happens in practice, we assign a mentor. So it'll be a senior partner from one of the firms to sit down and work through whatever questions the academic has and get them a little more focused on how things actually happen. And a perfect example of that is a project that we gave a couple of years ago where they were going to look at whether auditors sort of acquiesce after the earnings release when they find something that's different that would change the bottom line or the results. Would they, because the company's already done their earnings release, would they sort of back off and say, oh, well, you've already put it out, let's just let this slide? And what they wanted to do was, the example was a goodwill impairment. And as we sat around the table, all of the practitioners said, we would never let a goodwill impairment discussion not get settled before the earnings release. Where we have tension is in taxes, because that may not have been finalized by the time the company goes out to make their earnings release. Secondly, the project proposed to use auditors who had 4+ years experience. Everybody at the table said, those people do not make these decisions. They do not know what's going on at the time. So when I called the authors, I said, you know, we're going to give you this grant. We're going to give you a mentor because we think you have the wrong example. Also, we're going to have to give you senior managers and partners. And they're like, oh, okay. And even still, when we get proposals in, some of them will say, we're going to do something with audit seniors. Well, audit seniors are great, and they do a lot of work, but they're not in the decision-making process at the end. So I beg academics to be more realistic about what happens in practice. Audit seniors are great, they're plentiful, but they are not necessarily the ones who can give you actual real results that are going to be meaningful to practice. And then one other thing I would point out, you mentioned the timeliness of research. The beauty for us of giving these grants, and it's once you've had your mentor, you're on your own. So the research is independent. When you're done with your results, we don't come back and say, change this, change this. The idea is for you to get published. So the benefit for us is that those early papers come to the CAQ, and we do distribute that to the RAB members. So the practitioners are getting an early look at what is now going to take 2 to 3 years to get published, if you're lucky. So at least we get some insight into what you're finding. And with that, I will not get into how I don't like journal editors, but we'll talk about that later.
So on
Kurt,
that,
can you follow that one? Yeah.
let me also start with a disclaimer for myself and Hal. These are our own opinions, not those of the FASB. Official FASB positions are reached only after extensive deliberation and due process. And in particular, I'm the only academic on the FASB staff, so for certain what I'm saying then is not necessarily representative of the rest of the staff's views. So some background, my position at the FASB is relatively new. I'm the first postdoctoral fellow. I graduated from Stanford, took a job at Penn State, and then Penn State was kind enough to grant me immediate leave to come to the FASB for a year to do this. I go back to Penn State in July. Michael Durney, who's here, will be taking my spot at the FASB as the next postdoctoral fellow, kind of keeping this program going. And the objective of this program is to help bring in academic research and academic insights into the standard setting process, working directly with project teams, helping board members, and being a resource there for everyone in the building. So I work specifically with projects on segment reporting, disaggregating financial performance information, the conceptual framework, and then I've been a regular resource to projects about liabilities and equity, or goodwill, or sort of anything else that happens in the building. They come to me for sort of resources and information on how to think about academic research and what to make sense of that. I will assert that there is an overlap between topics and questions that are interesting to academics and that are helpful to standard setters. That is not a null set. There do exist an overlap there. And I'll say that the overlap isn't complete. That doesn't mean that every single question that's interesting to academics is helpful to standard setters. Nor do I think it necessarily has to be. I'm okay with there being some pure science, and there's some room for pure science to exist in the profession. But I think there is an overlap there, and my sense is that for this conference and other discussions, that people want to know what that overlap looks like. And there's an inherent interest in doing research that fits in that overlap. On the other side, not everything that's helpful to the FASB will be of interest to academics. There are some questions and some information that's needed that is just too esoteric and just isn't going to be interesting for anything for everyone to spend their time. But there is a set that's in the middle, and that's sort of what I think, trying to figure out what that is. So assuming that there is an academic who would like to figure out how to do research in that overlap, I have a couple suggestions. The first is I want to make a distinction between studying standard setters and studying issues that are important to standard setters. The former would include research thinking about political incentives of standard setters, whether they're captured by different interest groups, and that can apply to regulators as well. While that may be interesting to academics and may be important to Congress if we're speaking to someone like that, it's not actually helpful to the standard setting body themselves. And so if that's an objective of a researcher, focusing on political costs or political incentives isn't going to be helpful in helping that process move forward. What would be helpful is to understand the objective function of the standard setter. And I don't know about other regulators, but the FASB has a conceptual framework which lays out the objective of general purpose financial reporting, which is to provide information to users to help them assess their return to providing resources. And the conceptual framework further lays out the specific characteristics that the FASB thinks represent high quality accounting information: relevance, faithful representation, comparability, timeliness, verifiability. Those are all assertions that the FASB has made of things that come into their objective function. And in their deliberations, they discuss those concepts and figure out how should they make a decision in standard setting. If I were trying to help the FASB and I'm trying to figure out what information would be useful in that decision process, I'd want to understand that objective function and figure out how my research answers one of the pieces in that objective function and provides information that helps the FASB in making deliberations in that sense. Another point I would make is researchers, I think we tend to do a good job of pointing out problems, but we're less helpful in offering solutions. And while regulators and standard setters spend time finding problems, they spend a lot more time, many more years, trying to figure out solutions that might work. And I think there's an opportunity for us as academics to help there. That can be cross-sectional tests pointing out where problems are less severe and potentially where a solution might be found. It can also be evidence on underlying assumptions that are in proposed solutions. If we talk about timeliness, maybe the regulation hasn't happened yet, but there's a proposed path, and there's some beliefs that justify that decision being a proposed path. We can provide research that gives evidence on those assumptions that can be helpful before the regulation comes out or the standard comes out in helping guide that process along. I also want to point out that some of the discussions with the board that I've observed and with the staff are about issues of pervasiveness. We tend to do a lot of work on average effects as academics, but on average isn't necessarily good enough for a standard setter. They want to know, where does this problem lie and how many firms are we talking about? How many users are impacted? That's an issue that I think is helpful for them to get a sense of, because when they decide to add a project to the agenda or figure out how much time and resources they want to spend on that, they want to understand pervasiveness. I think we can do a little bit better job of providing some help on that. The third point I wanted to bring up is I think we use theory sometimes in an ineffective way relative to the research question. So, for example, the FASB right now is studying potentially requiring companies to disclose cost of revenue by segment. And if I think about how an academic might approach that knowledge, if I have a research question which is testing a theory of whether disaggregated information would be useful to investors, I'm going to go find some setting that would be novel and interesting and publishable in a top-tier journal about how would disaggregated information help users. And I'm probably not going to come to a setting that relates to segment reporting, which is the actual issue being studied here. On the other hand, if my question is, how would information about segment cost of revenue be useful, and would it not, then I'll bring in that theory that we have about how disaggregated information might decrease cost of capital, but I'll also bring in theories about competitive harm and why companies might change disclosures and how they might change the way that they define their segments, sort of detailed information about the standard. And so in that sense, the setting is the primal point, not the theory that I'm trying to test. And there's a lot of times, I think, where we ask questions that are based on testing some theory, and we're so far removed from what the setting is, And if we think about the setting first, we bring in theory as a tool to help us understand the setting, not an objective in and of itself. The last point that I think, I echo Mike's point earlier about neutrality. I think we are maybe the only resource out there that can really be objective in providing evidence of what the world looks like. If the FASB were to commission a study in response to some political pressure, everyone would discount the results because the FASB commissioned it. Who did they get to do it? What were their incentives? If a banking group commissions a study, everyone questions the results of that study because it was commissioned by the banking group. We have a unique opportunity being academics who are objective and neutral, where we can provide evidence that isn't tainted in those ways. And I think preserving that is really important for our research to be useful to regulators and standard setters, and keeping that ability we have to influence the world for good in that way. And with that, I'll just remind us, my last point is, it's a privilege, I think, as an academic to be involved in this process. It's not a right. Standard setters and regulators, their job is to help solve the world's problems, not just to listen to us. And to the extent we can be helpful, I think that's a great thing. But we need to remember it's a privilege and not a right.
Kurt, thank you. And just as a reminder, this session is being recorded. And I'm going to play back a part of what Kurt said to one of my brothers-in-law, who's a PhD professor who writes a lot of academic research. And he's great at identifying problems. But when I talk to him, well, how would you solve that? Well, I don't know. That's not my issue to deal with. So I'm going to play that back for him several times. I'm sure I'll win friends there. But Christine has set up the rest of this session kind of in 4 segments. I'm going to call 2 of them level setting, and the other kind of dig into gaps and what are some really good research opportunities here. So the first 2 sessions are really about internal research, what's happening today. Kind of, that's why I call it level setting. What's actually being done internally at the various organizations represented here. And then the second session is how do we use academic research today, all right? In talking through with Christine, the gap area was where she was most interested. Her observation was that there was a supply-demand imbalance. Put more bluntly, and maybe this is, Peter, this is the provocative aspect of what she was saying, is that, you know, what you're producing isn't usable for standard setting process. Right? And she was pretty blunt about that. So there's a real mismatch between supply and demand. I push back a little bit because I think there's some really good academic research, and I don't know where Ann Beatty is here, but she raised something on a conference call earlier, a couple weeks ago, as we were preparing for our session later, and she mentioned some academic research. Well, I did actually pull that research out, thanks to Kurt, and read it, and I've read it several times out, and it was tremendously helpful to defending against some particular argument. So, you know, I don't think the mismatch is as great as Christine has suggested. But what I will tell you is that it's not being pushed toward the users of the information. And let me just give you, by example, a parallel situation. I came from an investing world. I worked on the sell side where I produced research, and then I lived the last 11 years before being a board member. I lived in the world of having research pushed toward me. There was not a single day of the week that went by without me getting multiple phone calls and emails about the newest, latest, greatest research on fill in the blank, right? So you could say I was being spoon-fed the information. A large portion of it was absolutely irrelevant. It was much more reporting of information, but there was always those important nuggets, and it was very helpful to have it pushed to me. I don't have that same luxury here. In fact, when I had to go, you know, Ann Beatty mentioned that particular research, I had to go to Kurt. Kurt, where is that information? Can you get it for me? I had no idea how to find it, right? So I think that's an important thing. It's not just a consumption, misbalance or imbalance. There's also a distribution imbalance where you don't have a distribution system set up to push research out to those who could actually use it. And there may be some incentives in the system that preclude you from doing that, and maybe that's a good area for discussion. But I want to, we're going to go through each of these areas and talk about and get the panelists' perspectives on each of these areas. But we're also going to encourage you to ask questions. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, and I see at least one old colleague of mine. Yes, Tom, I use the word old.
2 weeks older.
It's 2 weeks, Tom. It's 2 weeks. It's a long-running jesting between Tom and myself. So what will happen, because this is a recorded session, we did get the mics? There are mics available? Okay. Look, I should have looked to the person who knows. Why am I looking at you, Mike? I don't know. Thank you. All right. So if you'd wait for the microphone to appear, that'll save me from having to repeat the question. Again, being recorded, so we want to get all the questions and answers on. So let's go ahead and start with the first topic. It's really internal research. And the gist of the opening question is, how does your organization use and develop internal research, not academic? What does it do today to do research? And Kurt, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you and let others jump in.
Sure. So I would characterize most of the research done by the FASB staff as interviews, very, very detailed information with like 5, 6, 7 companies, sometimes users. A couple surveys, which maybe reach a sample size of 20 to 25 if we're lucky, and then comment letters that companies or users or other stakeholders sort of send in information. There's also an XBRL department where you get a little bit closer to archival research in the fact that they're looking at sort of what does the population of SEC filers do. But that, I think, is sort of how it's used. I think what the staff does a good job drawing information from is getting potential theories. And so if you think that the goal is just to get a potential theory about why something would or would not work, interviews with few people and surveys actually seem to be pretty effective, and they're pretty good at doing that. I think we could do a better job at the FASB, in my opinion, of understanding then sort of how do those theories play out in the real world, and what's the population that sort of follows one theory versus the other. And that's where academic research, I think, can sort of help do that.
Kurt, if you don't mind, I'm going to just add one aspect to this. When I first joined the board, if we're supposed to be providing decision-useful information to investors, well, let's just go and ask the investors. We know a lot of them. We'll get them all into a room like this, and we'll just start asking them questions. I was a little naive. First of all, think about what's happening out there in the investor world. You've got the sell side. They're competing against each other to get the newest, latest, greatest information. They're basically competing for commission dollars. On the buy side, they're frankly competing for the next best idea to invest in. They don't want to give any hints away. So getting people to talk to us in an environment where they know it's going to be recorded and can be used and all that is incredibly difficult. And I see that as actually one of the areas where academic research can come in and really help overcome that hurdle. It's just a real practical problem we have. And if there was any doubt, I told my fellow board members at the time, I said, oh, no problem. I can get these people in the room, and I know them all, and they'll all talk because they like to talk. You could hear a pin drop in that room the first time and only time we tried it, because exactly as I said, they're competitors, and I think it's even worse today because the market's gotten harder, competition's gotten harder. We can get into long discussions about quantitative analysis and everything. It is very difficult for us to get investors to talk to us, to the point some firms will not even allow their analysts to talk to us. If they're not spending 110% of their time investing, why, the FASB, we don't care what they're doing. We care about making money today, versus a standard that'll come out 10 years later. All right? So that's kind of the mindset. Paul, do you want to jump in, or?
Yeah, and so in terms of, I'd say research that we do internally, it starts, so let's say that we're trying to research how we think about something that Hal's working on or something that Sagar's working on. And we're trying to think about the question and how we should think about what would be an appropriate view. I think we typically start by trying to assess the population. And so we do that several ways. One is we'll start with company filings and identify those that we think might have relevant views on the matter. we'll reach out to engagement teams. And we do this to understand the nuances that exist. I think what happens a lot is people look at an issue and they jump to a conclusion. And so one of the things that we do is we try to talk to people who are answering the question on a day-to-day basis, because there's always a nuance, and try to understand what that nuance is. And so we start from, I'll say, a data perspective, but then go into, I'll say, more of an interview perspective, so that we can understand how it is we should be thinking about the process, or thinking about the question. And then it will then get bubbled up to a smaller group of people who will take that information and try to determine how we as a firm should think about whether it's a new FASB accounting standard or something that the commission's put out.
No, let Sagar go first. Yeah, because he has a lot.
Well, we're fortunate from a building-wide perspective to have DERA, which is the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis. So ballpark, this is an exact number, 100, 110 PhD financial economists. They do a bunch of things. They do research. There's a whole webpage we have on that. Some of that research is on the website. You can pick up papers on, private capital raising and what folks might find interesting on that. So there's kind of that bucket. And then the bucket that will interact more with them in OCA is, as Paul mentioned, if we're thinking about a proposed rule or something along those lines, DERA will do the economic study. So they'll go in and identify costs, identify benefits, et cetera, and kind of do the economic analysis, which you'll see in each of the rulemakings. It's very prominent. They'll kind of go through their analysis of, okay, depending on what the rule is, if you do X, that's the baseline. What are your alternatives? If you go down this route, out comes the output. Very, very useful from our perspective. And so obviously there's, a lot of areas in our space that overlap. One area that we've been working with FASB on is our project we affectionately call Duster, but that's to reduce duplication, simplify things that maybe the FASB have been working on or is working on, and that are also in our rules, to make sure that maybe it's not in two places. So kind of on a project like that would be typically us and CorpFin leading. No doubt DERA was critical in each of the pieces before the rule went out. You can kind of see their analysis on, was there anything lost to investors and what's the potential cost and so forth. So from our lens, that's a very, very critical group. They were formed in 2009, so relatively new, certainly by kind of the length of some of our other divisions. And so they integrate with the other offices and divisions in a terrific manner. We invite them to different meetings. We've had certainly meetings on CECL and other standards where we want to understand what certain people are saying. We'll invite DERA and get the experts on to make sure that we're getting what we perceive our folks to be kind of the neutral and unbiased view. So from a resource point of view, it is absolutely terrific as we kind of think about what folks are alluding to. Ultimately, we have to make a decision on something. And they certainly bolster our insight on the decision. So Hal, that's kind of the foundation of our.
Can I just add one thing to Sagar's comments? So they were founded in 2009, and the commission after 2009 had gone through a series of rulemakings that ultimately got overturned because of inadequate cost-benefit analysis. And so one of the things the commission and DERA did, which I actually think this was great, and they published a framework about how they're going to think about cost-benefit analysis. And I think that framework has really helped DERA do a much better job in terms of the cost-benefit. I don't think they've had anything overturned since then. And it was insightful because it acknowledged that there are certain things you can't quantify. And it talked about how you consider benefits to the market when you can't explicitly calculate a number. It's always easy to come up and calculate a cost number. But calculating the benefits that might be inherent in any regulation are difficult. But I think DERA did a good job of articulating what that framework is. And it's on the website. It's public. They made it public. And the PCAOB then has sort of adopted a similar framework. And so as you're thinking about academic research and about, hey, how can I influence what the commission's doing, think about it through the lens that DERA is then going to analyze it. Because I think that would help make it more relevant to the commission.
Okay, so internally, the CAQ, sort of one of our missions is to convene and collaborate different stakeholders around issues that are important to the capital markets. So one of the things that we do internally, not using academics, is trying to get groups together, what we call the financial reporting supply chain. So we'll bring together audit committee members, internal audit, external audit, and financial execs to thrash through some issue. And sometimes we try very hard to get investors to sit at the table with us. So at the very beginning, back in 2009, we started to focus on fraud. There was the whole Treasury advisory, let's come up with a fraud center. CAQ sort of just went forward anyway to figure out how we could work together inside of the supply chain. So we had several roundtable dinners where we talked about, who is responsible, what do they do, what can be done, et cetera, and came up with a report and formed this anti-fraud collaboration. And that collaboration works together to provide thought pieces and other resources that folks can use to deter and detect financial reporting fraud. We've done a series of webcasts, et cetera. We've also pulled together people to talk about audit quality indicators, what's important, what is meaningful. And what we got out of those conversations is that, yes, the audit committees want to know about audit quality indicators, but they don't want a whole list, and they don't want sort of cookie cutter thing. They only want to know what they want to know, kind of like investors only want to know what they want to know, but have it all available so they can find it.
And when we want to know it, too.
Yeah.
Don't forget that.
Just recently, we did something we published, probably about a year ago now, on non-GAAP. We brought together the same types of groups, several different workshops talking about what people think about different non-GAAP, financial, non-financial, KPIs, et cetera. What do they want to know? What do they want attestation against those measures? Another report that we did, and as we do these collaboration and convening, we will sort of summarize what we found and put them out as reports. One of the other papers that I worked on was we had done some analysis on SEC enforcement actions that involved ICFR, and concluded that where we had the biggest problem with frauds and ICFR issues were in the auditing of complex estimates. So we pulled together everybody in the supply chain and to talk about these issues and what could be done, and published a report. So those are the kinds of things we try to do in terms of, here are the issues, here's what people are saying around the whole, I guess now people call it the ecosystem, but I still call it the supply chain. And then the other thing we do internally is when our favorite congressman here or there comes up with some bright idea about rolling back 404 for different categories of company size, we will go into audit analytics and run some numbers and figure out how many companies does this entail, what kind of industries are they in, et cetera, just so we have something that we can write talking points against and figure out really what the impact will be. You're going to say something, aren't you?
This time it wasn't a bright congressman, it was the commission.
Yeah, that was just last week, yes. But so we do that internally, and it helps to inform our teams when they're writing comment letters, either usually for a PCAOB standard or to the commission.
Do I have to separate you two now?
In general, yes.
And to be clear, I'm not actually passing a value judgment on what they did. You just commented
Yes.
a little cheekily that it's a bright congressman, and I'm just pointing out that the commission went through a process through DERA and said, this is actually a good idea, or proposing, so.
Well, are people...
Yeah, let me give a little bit of background here.
So, either of us can do it. So, I think a week and a half ago, roughly, the commission put out for proposal, and there was a open statement on this, and I think two of the other commissioners spoke on it about 404B, and, you know, a proposal to reduce the number of companies that need the 404B audit procedure kind of report done. So, you know, people will have the chance to comment and so forth. And obviously that, over the last couple of years has been of high interest to people. There was a lot of work obviously done in the building on that. And so certainly we, the commission, would certainly welcome people's comments and so forth on that. But that's what Paul was alluding to.
So you're trying to align the smaller reporting company
It
definition?
doesn't line up, no.
Oh,
It'll be different. It'll be different. And so that was actually what one commissioner had suggested, but that's not what the current rule reads as. So it'll be fewer of those companies than that bucket.
In the proposal, there is an analysis by DERA. And so DERA has to go through and weigh the costs and benefits. And so if you're looking for an example, a good example of DERA doing that research and doing that analysis, I think this is a good one. Now, then I think people have to weigh in from a policy perspective about whether they weighed the right costs and the right benefits. And that's what the process is it's out for proposal, and they've asked some very thoughtful questions, and, you know, the relevant groups are gonna go through, so investors, auditors, companies are gonna weigh in. And so if you're looking to better understand how the process works and how it plays out, this is a good one to look at.
Yeah, I've always thought of the audit as the guardrails. You know, I knew that if I could always rely on the earnings release and supplemental packages that come out before the Qs and the Ks, but now you're taking away, or that the potential is to take away that guardrail. So I'd be very interested in what that increased uncertainty does in the marketplace. I mean, that was one of my initial reactions, is there's going to be increased uncertainty. I don't have those guardrails, or at least to the same degree, and I had not read the DERA aspect of this. I'm going to be very interested to see how they kind of thought through that aspect of it. So I just throw that out as an idea.
Yeah, no, exactly. And what Paul, I mean, it just at its foundation is just what Paul said. It comes down to cost benefit and what people perceive that to be, particularly for the smaller companies, is the impact worth.
That's another way I looked at it, is it's raised my cost of investigating that particular company. So I've got X amount of time and things that I'm looking at in terms of making a decision, do I invest in company A or B, is how large is it, how liquid is it, how volatile is the stock, how much homework do I have to do, is there enough sell-side coverage on it? Those are all things, but audit was never an issue for me because I knew they were all being audited by and large by the big four firms, all right? Now I've taken a step back from that. How does that change my process, particularly as I go into smaller and smaller companies? How does that change my thought process? So,
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Yeah, and then you would weigh it against kind of the, you know,
Right.
the management doesn't have those costs, they can spend their time on other things, and then you have to kind of pull that. They are still getting an audit, just to be clear. So it would just be the report on the internal control piece that would go away. So, and then the company still has to perform, they still have to have ICFR and so forth. So just to be clear on kind of what it is taking away.
No,
and
appreciate
not
that.
taking away.
Yeah, I'm totally unencumbered by facts at this point, so I appreciate that.
Well, that's the best kind of debate to have.
I could go on with that, but I'm going to leave that one drop, Paul. We have not had a single question from the floor yet. And I'm looking around, and Tom, don't make me call on you. Tom?
There's two.
Oh, great. Jeff? Wait, sorry, Mike. They were so excited, they didn't know which one was going to get your first question, Jeff.
So you talked a little bit about the way in which you conduct research within your organizations, but I was wondering if you could also comment on a little more on how you go about trying to interpret academic research that's being done, because it's, you know, it is different objective functions, sometimes conducted in a pretty different way. So how do you consume it?
We're probably the group that consumes it the least, just because as we think about providing comments,
We being
practitioners.
practitioners.
So practitioners providing comments, we view we've got a role in the process, but we're assuming that Hal, Sagar, and others are using the academic research as best they can. I mean, I think there's questions about how much they use it and whether it's useful or not, but we personally don't spend a lot of time having academic research influence our responses, just because I think Hal and Sagar are looking for us from if we do this, can can preparers prepare it, B, can auditors audit? And so that's sort of our expertise. And we try to provide the views from that perspective as opposed to the more theoretical, how does this research support the overall conclusion?
Paul, I think it's an important point. Margot and I were talking about this at breakfast this morning. Kind of 3 test. Is it understandable? Right? You can write a great accounting standard, but if it's not understandable to the ultimate consumers, it's not very helpful. Is it auditable? Can you audit it? And is it operable? I mean, those are kind of the 3 important tests that you have to overcome with every standard.
Okay. As you know, Jeff, because you've been there, one of the things that the CAQ does is this annual symposium where we bring practitioners and researchers together for basically a full day to talk about some issue that we have decided is important and that we think the academics should have a clearer understanding of what happens in practice. And then after the panel discussions, we have smaller groups, and having gone around the tables and listened in on some of the smaller group discussions, sometimes there's the aha moment on the practitioner side that, oh, there is research out there that touches on whatever this issue is. But the other, and I think for me, the greatest benefit of this symposium is to get academics to hear what really is happening and how things are done in practice. Because the longer I think that you're 5 years in a PhD program, et cetera, the longer you're in academia, the further away you are, even if you ever audited in your life. And most of the people who do research, the senior faculty, are audited pre-Sarbanes-Oxley, so there's issues there.
Thanks for reminding me of that, yeah.
Kind of jumping on, so as I mentioned earlier, basically we have to kind of decide, and we want the best information to decide. So if that best information could be something that the folks in this room are working on, certainly we want to understand that and know that. So the way we try to capture it, but no doubt it can be enhanced from a system perspective, is, like I said, we have 2 folks, so 4% of our workforce who kind of know this area, right? And so it's usually, Ying, for example, will be like, oh, there was a study here, if we were thinking about, PCAOB transparency standard, right? There's this really interesting work done that, you might want to understand kind of the accounts that, an engagement partner was on, were they on the riskiest accounts, and so if they've had a restatement, well, what does that mean, and so forth. And so without her, would we have known about stuff like that? Less easy, right? To kind of the earlier points. Do we want that information? Of course. We just want all the information to make the best decision possible. And so to some extent, from the seat I have, is relying heavily on the academic fellow we have, and then kind of the professional we have. So anything we can kind of think about of enhancing that, making sure our doors are open would be helpful. We certainly participate in a number of academic conferences and have relationships with folks on that. So it's certainly a critical part of that, and I want people to feel free to call and so forth and use. But I think this would be an area of enhancement. It seems like good low-hanging fruit of, if the information's there, I mean, we have absolutely the desire to look at it.
At the FASB, that's my job, is to interpret it for everybody. In that respect, I think it's maybe appreciate the importance of acknowledging limitations, because if I have to spend a long time with a paper trying to figure out, like, what are the boundaries under which these conclusions can operate, it's harder to get the information into the staff's memos and into the board for decision making when the paper is very, very clear that here's what we find and here's the world under which what we find, like, we can conclude about. That's easier for the research to be digested and to communicate that and interpret it clearly for the board members. Conflicting studies are fine, and different conclusions in different populations are okay. Helps the board sort of figure out what the world looks like. My plug to editors is be okay with studies that inconclusive results, because the world can be inconclusive, and sometimes it's important to know that a reasonable test produces inconclusive results. So,
Kurt, I'm just going to throw one to you. I've asked you on several occasions, can you, and I use the term literature review, and I probably don't use it accurately, because what I'm asking you to do is go find everything on a particular topic and tell me the pros and cons. Would literature reviews used more in an academic environment, would those ultimately be more helpful to us?
Sometimes that's what my source material that I'm drawing from for preparing that.
So it's a good starting point then.
Yeah, and sometimes when a specific
Oh,
study.
so you've been cheating and you didn't tell me. I thought you were doing all this on your,
It's in that reference list I send you, right? Sometimes when a specific study, where it is sort of critical to understand that, I'll reach out to the authors. Sort of a plug, I think it's important for the regulators and standard setters to have engagement back with the people writing the papers. If you send a paper to the FASB because you think it's interesting and you say, of interest to standard setters, regulators, et cetera, like we all do. If it's not, I'm going to tell you, just because I want you to have that feedback that what you said actually isn't relevant to us, and here's how to make your papers more relevant. I think it's important, otherwise we don't learn as academics how to produce something that's helpful. I think it's important for if someone submits a paper to the SEC or the CAQ that feedback would be useful to the authors to improve their process and make it helpful.
and do we get those on a regular basis when literature reviews are done? Do people send those to us, or how do we know they're out there?
So at the FASB, at least, if you go to fasb.org/academics, there's like a email link you can send papers to us, and they come to me and they go to the project staff that's relevant for that particular topic. If it's relevant enough, it makes it up to the board, and we welcome that feedback. It's helpful for us. When it's something that's good, the staff will write it into their memos to the board, where they describe all the pros and cons of a particular approach and the evidence that backs up some of the assumptions underlying those pros and cons. And so that type of information is always helpful, if it's good.
And if it has links, it's even better, because it saves a lot of time.
So just quickly, one follow-up on that, and that last point was very helpful. I think understanding an easy way for academics to know if they have something that they think is relevant for a particular regulator or standard setter or a practitioner, knowing how to get it to the right channels is very helpful. So that I love the fact that the FASB actually now has a dedicated email account, which it still is a matter of like, can you find it? But it's probably pretty easy to find, right? So that's great. I'm wondering. Yeah, that's right. That doesn't mean we're good at what we do. So we weren't trained in searching for email. So but wondering, for the rest of you, is there a place that we should send? Like, who should we send information to? I assume that you don't have necessarily an email address like that for academics.
I mean, for us, you could certainly send it to, the academic that we have, kind of the fellow, the 1 year, or, Ying. We have a mailbox too, kind of on the OCA website. So within the SEC, if you go to OCA, we'll have a website. We have a general mailbox that we monitor, so you could send that there. You could call. I mean, we interact with lots of people, right? And we try to be easy to find. And so, off the top of my head, I don't think we have something like that, but that doesn't mean there's any resistance at all. And so any of those channels would work.
And I guess to me.
Just one word of caution. Occasionally I get research report, academic studies and things in my email. I personally am a little hesitant to open it up, because if I don't know you, there's so many viruses and problems out there, I'm not really certain. So that's something where, I think going into a particular box designed for it is helpful, at least from my standpoint. So if I haven't responded, if you've sent me a study and I haven't responded, that's why I haven't studied, because I actually like reading them, but I'm a little fearful these days of opening things up, not certain who's sending it and what virus could be in there. So just a practical problem.
So I guess my question is evolving to make it more relevant to the previous question. But one of the initiatives that the PCAOB did, I think it was like 2008 and 2012, is they created synthesis teams. So they got kind of experts in the area to summarize the literature and talk about the current state of the literature, how it's relevant to the PCAOB and kind of future directions. So I guess the question I would have, has the FASB or the SEC considered this? And I'll parlay that into this recent internal control threshold change. One of the original proposals was to increase it from 75 million public float to 250 million public float. And it was I was taken aback by the switch to 100 million revenue or less, because you could have a lot of scenarios, particularly with biotech firms, where you have, public float of, 2 billion or something, but yet less than 100 million revenue. And then you start questioning how many people are invested and all this other stuff. So I was just wondering, based on the previous question, has the FASB or the SEC considered, instead of just having 1 or 2 academic fellows kind of summarize that literature and contact those authors, have they thought about actually engaging them on special topics that are of relevance and try to get teams of 5, 6 of us to work together to kind of synthesize the literature and then, of course, produce a report? It worked very well for the PCOB in those 2 initiatives.
So I'll speak from the FASB standpoint. That's exactly something that we are currently considering. I think they hadn't had an academic for a while at the FASB before I came, and part of what I'm doing is helping them understand the importance of what's out there. And then that's exactly sort of something we're looking at is if there's a particular topic, let's grab 3 or 4 academics who work in that area, have them come together. If they have differing views, even better, because we can sort of understand under what conditions does it sort of work and not work in terms of the conclusions that's in the literature.
Just to be clear, you meant academics on the staff. We had Tom.
I'm sorry. Yes, academics on the staff.
We have Christine.
That was my point,
Just
yes.
being clear.
Yep.
And you had Catherine Schipper. There's a long,
That's right.
there's a long history of
Academic fellows on the
board.
staff, yes.
Much more fun to harass you. I only have a month more to go with you, so.
Certainly, those types of reviews are helpful. Obviously, in our coordination with the PCOB, right? We statutorily have to do a lot of things from the Sarbanes-Oxley Act with them and do so. And so in terms of kind of our relationship with them, we would capture that kind of through our interaction. But certainly, again, I don't of all the expertise we have. I want to make sure everybody realizes it's. I know I've talked about DERA before, but it's obviously everything that DERA has. And the breadth of that, as well as kind of the folks we have, so that's, I think, kind of how we would kind of have captured the interaction on those PCOB items that you had mentioned.
Other questions? Ed, down here in front. Yeah. No.
So,
Tom will be next.
This is for Kurt and Hal. I appreciate the provocative comments, and one of the ones that I thought was provocative is your statement that research is a privilege and not a right. So I'm wondering, is there something underlying that? Has there been some bad behavior on part of academics that has sort of tainted the water there a little bit?
So I think my comment was to be involved in the process is a privilege, not a right. I think I just recognize, as an academic and as the one academic on the staff in the building, I said it correctly, we see the world differently that I didn't appreciate until sort of being there. And I think it's important to recognize that while we may want the world to be a certain way because it makes our research easy, it might not necessarily be helpful to what the FASB or the commission or people are doing. And so just recognizing that we're sort of helpful in this process. It's not like we are a key player that absolutely has to be considered. And so we don't want to abuse that link that we have as well by producing lots of garbage, I think, for the FASB organizations. That was kind of my point. It's just we have an opportunity to be a guest and be helpful, and we should try to do that.
And I'm going to go back to something Kurt said early on, that academics are going to be viewed much more as an independent, resource. We've seen a number of studies purported to be academic studies, but when you look at who wrote them and what their motivations were, you really have to question them. Unfortunately, what happens is those types of, and I'm putting studies in quotes because I don't think they would be peer reviewable, frankly, when you really dig into what was done. They were written to achieve a specific conclusion. They weren't there to find truth. They were there to find a particular conclusion. And those, when they get into the ecosystem, if you will, are really hard to get out of the system. They quite often get quoted over and over and over again. And sorry to use another credit losses example, but there was one quote or one study that said, reserves were going up 500%, and then that escalated. It took years to get that quote out of the media. it kept coming up. A study to show that reserves will go up 500%. Couldn't have been further from the truth, but once they're out there, they're really hard to get out of the system.
And I would just say that phenomena, while not common, does happen, and it happens sort of across the spectrum, though. I mean, it's not just companies trying to push a policy view, but you see it across the spectrum, and in some cases by, I would say, fairly noteworthy academics. And when you look at it and you say, okay, this isn't even peer reviewable, you sort of question, well, why are you even putting it out? And it actually, I mean, I think that's a place where this group could self-police, is when you see that, point it out and say, hey, this person put out this study, but it's not even you can't even peer review it, it's so bad. And even if it's, one of the well-known academics, I think it's important for this group to call those situations out.
Tom?
When I was on the commission staff, dealing with rulemaking, the cost-benefit analysis came at the very end, after almost all the decisions have been made. Is that still the case? Or is it more one in which there's analysis during the process and trying to understand whether different alternatives being considered are perhaps more cost beneficial than others?
Yeah, no, great question, Tom. At least in my interaction the last 2 years, it's been the latter, which is good, right? It's been with an open mind. Is it perfect? Of course not. But is it generally in that direction where you want the best information to make the decision? Yeah. So I think the emphasis has been there.
I'll speak to my experience through the Dodd-Frank rulemaking, and I view this as a positive. There's been a professionalism of the cost-benefit analysis. And I think you're right. I mean, when I first got there, we did some rulemakings, and the last piece that was written was the cost-benefit. But with the advent of DERA and the work they're doing, I remember rulemakings where we were still trying to formulate our ideas, and we had meetings with DERA. And, okay, what's out there? How does it work? And asking questions about, okay, when you have to write the cost-benefit analysis, what do you need? And sort of, I don't want to say co-developing the rulemaking, because it probably hasn't evolved to that, and we could have debates about whether it should or shouldn't, but if there's 10 steps, they're in step 2 now, as opposed to being step 1, or step 10. So it has really improved, and I think that's a positive.
All these hands are up, but I have the mic. So, I want to speak to 2 issues, and the first is this privilege one. So I worked with FASB for a while, and there were staff members that, Ray Pfeiffer, for example, way back in the day. And one of the issues, this notion, people on the staff and board would get annoyed with academics who weren't using, words matter, as Christine said, and you have all these academics who are talking about matching, which is not the way FASB thinks about it. And so there is a sense that you have to earn your way into, to getting listened to, which cuts both ways, because on the one hand, it is a privilege to be able to influence policy. On the other hand, you have to sort of buy into a lot of what, of things that FASB has already sort of settled on. And I'm wondering if all of you, or any of you who have thoughts of that, maybe FASB or SEC or your own, how should academics be balancing that? Because how independent are we really if we're already, being forced to buy into frameworks that, a lot of academics don't agree with? And then I also have a specific question for Margot, which is, you seem to have strong feelings about editors. And since I'm leading the editors panel later, I'm hoping you'll elaborate on those.
So not being an academic, that whole process of submitting a paper in 2012 and not getting it published until 2019 or 2018 is very frustrating for practice. I know it's very frustrating for the academics. There's, as somebody, a partner at one of the firms told me years ago, academic researchers in accounting eat their young. And when I have people coming back to me saying, hey, you gave us access to auditors 5 years ago, and now they want us to go out and collect more data to answer this one other question, I think, isn't that yet another journal article? Why does it have to be part of something that you started 7 years ago? That's my frustration. I'm
Mary-
sure it's
oh.
everybody's.
Mary Barth, I saw you getting very excited back there. And as one of our newest trustees at the foundation, I want to make sure I call on her.
Cute, very cute, Hal. I just want to react to Rob before someone on the panel addresses the question, because I actually think of it as a different way, not accepting, use the example of matching. It's not necessarily accepting that matching exists, it's understanding that matching doesn't exist. It's understanding that they think that way. So precision in language is a means of communication. And so if you act as if you don't know they've already decided, then they're going to perceive that you don't know what's going on. Whereas you say, I know you've decided, but I think you're wrong. I think that's still fair game. I don't think you have to accept the decision. It's more about having a meaningful conversation. They talk in code just like we talk in code, and we've got to get rid of the code. And I think that's what it's about. So that's the only reason I wanted to get that in before somebody responded to his question. We'll come back to Margot's concern about journal editors later.
It's probably more the reviewers.
You're on your own on this.
Peter, I think we achieved the objective of being provocative. Margot, do you have anything else that you want to add? Okay. This gentleman's been very patient here.
Sorry, can I respond to Rob's
sure.
question
Yep.
first? So language I would have said along with Mary. Part of it is just using terminology that the staff will understand. Increases the perceived credibility of the paper. If it's language we understand, like if it was written in Japanese, it's just going to be harder for us to use. That's one. I think also, even if one believes that the decision to not put matching in the framework is wrong, papers on that are helpful and they're objective and they're neutral and that's good. If the goal is to advance the current agenda, though, like if all the papers are about matching, then that becomes less helpful at the time. And so there is a balance, I think, between acknowledging that maybe what the FASB is doing we disagree with, but there are certain aspects that we can be helpful for. Myself, if I disagree with something that a direction on the agenda, like I'll try to do research that still helps other parts as well. So that's sort of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, from the SEC perspective, like I said, I think we're open to good ideas. The key for us is just the timing, right? We have to make a decision at some point, and so getting that idea within the timing is most helpful, right? So right now, like on CECL, for example, if there was research out there, that would be really, really helpful. Understand why there's not, right? Tend to wait until data is done and people implement and so forth, right? But we'd be all ears on really, anything on that, right? So it's about, the quality of the information and then the timeliness. And then really it's the best idea, it's a meritocracy. That's what we're looking for in terms of our kind of interaction with you folks.
Okay, so I have a question, but also an observation. So the question I'm curious, and it started, I forgot whether it was Hal or Paul made the comment that accounting is not a social science, that it is a form of communication. And I'm wondering whether the conversation we would be having would be different if we were talking about economics rather than accounting. And so imagine we would be talking about, say, environmental regulation, or we would be talking about labor regulation, so minimum wage or something like that. Would you have different answers for us, or would you say some of the conversation that we've had would be very similar, acknowledging that we're all not experts in environmental issues or labor necessarily? And the observation is, so that was the question, the observation is, I think hearing this conversation, my sense is we probably need to do much more on the intermediation, meaning we're, as researchers, we're producing work that sometimes is relevant to specific questions and sometimes it's not. And you're having frustration with sort of figuring out when it is, how to use it, when to do it. And as Mary just said, we speak very different languages at times. So I wonder whether we need to be much more deliberate in creating interfaces and forms of intermediation that basically facilitate that process. And I think Joe was getting at that with the synthesis teams as one idea. But I think if you're looking at other fields, they have been much more deliberate in that process in terms of aggregating, bringing the research together, and then having a message that's understandable to practitioners, regulators, or whoever the consumers are of the research.
So I was the one who made the comment and was really redirecting or highlighting something that was in the Wheat Commission in terms of the Wheat Commission, when they founded the FASB, had that view. And the only point is that all of this is subject to perspective. It's not like gravity. I mean, we can prove out gravity. Well, at least today, we can prove out gravity. Someone's probably smarter than me thinking about how to re-articulate gravity. I don't know. But like the physical sciences, you can boil it down to mathematics, and you can boil it down to certainty. When you talk about things like the conceptual framework, if we divide it up into groups of 4 and said, okay, everyone has to write a conceptual framework, the one thing I can guarantee is we'd have 4 different conceptual frameworks. And so your question about like economics, I don't know what happens in that field, but it sounds like the way you phrased the question, there's probably greater collaboration. And so if people have ideas about how to better collaborate, meaning having the academic community and the profession through the CAQ or the regulator or the standard setter, I think that's something we should be doing. Because I think there's a lot of bright people in here and they have a lot of really great ideas, and sort of, breaking down whatever barriers exist, I think is important.
Some right here. Okay.
Okay. So you've been talking about the benefits of peer review and the objectiveness that the academics can bring. What comes along with that, though, is that it takes more time and that it's usually not targeted questions. So there is this natural tension. Would you prefer having academic, I don't know if it'd be called comment letters or thought pieces, where they bring in, this is kind of related to Christian's comment, they bring in literature that might be related, they bring in theory and speak to that question. The disadvantage, though, is that this isn't part of the normal setup and it's not going to be as peer-reviewed or as objective necessarily. So what would you see as most beneficial?
Kurt, do you want to take that first? Or?
Sure. So I guess if I think from the staff perspective, where they're looking at a potential solution to a problem and they're just trying to figure out what are the arguments or nuances, to use Paul's word, that might be out there, peer reviewed or not, can still be an argument. And the staff is going to evaluate that based on, like, what do we think about the argument? Can we think of issues with it? What are other arguments that might counteract with that? At that point in the process, I think it's like, it's maybe not as important to have a peer-reviewed aspect. I mean, a working paper that hasn't been peer-reviewed can be helpful at that stage. Papers that are published in non-top journals might still make it into the staff analysis because it's a good thought piece and it has some perspective that they're trying to consider. When it gets to the point where we're trying to figure out pervasiveness of what's out there in the world, that's where, when I can't replicate the data that someone did in their paper, I want to make sure that it's been done correctly. And for me, that's where the peer review process is helpful, where some other smart people, hopefully the reviewers, looked at that paper and they figured out that, the descriptives and the setting seems to make sense with what we would expect in that area. And I can rely on that a little bit more. At the early stage, I think maybe the peer review is a little bit less helpful if the goal is just to get a perspective and a theory and an argument to evaluate.
I guess I'd just add to that thought process. I'm looking for really smart people who are used to dealing with a particular issue and can help think through. And the quicker I can get those thoughts in, as long as they're, collectively they've really thought through the process, I want to get that earlier. The peer review becomes less important to me if I know that they have a history of thinking about a particular problem or issue and can pull research together quickly. That's going to be more valuable to me than that final step, if you will. I think the final step is important. It's that guardrail that audit provides in general. I think it's important, but sometimes timing is more important than.
So the analogy is the earnings release and the 10Q.
Yep, pretty much.
Okay.
Yep.
From our lens, I completely agree. I mean, I think we're often left with imperfect answers. We have to choose between A, B, and C, and all have flaws. We have to make a call on one of them. We can't not make the call. And so the key to me is, even if it's not perfect, if it's a good thought and the timeliness, that would help inform A, B, or C. To lose all of it, to fine tune it, that doesn't feel great. And certainly the information we get is oftentimes not perfect. I think that's just the way the system is. But that's okay. I mean, we've done a pretty good job with that, and so it's not, and this can only kind of bolster it. So.
And just one other thought, Kurt had mentioned, so many of your papers say these findings have implications for practitioners, standard setters, and regulators. And that's great, but there are opportunities where you can, like when there's the EU Green Paper, or there's a proposed standard out there, to take what you think is relevant to standard setters, regulators, and practitioners, and put it in English, so that standard setters, regulators, and practitioners can understand how you've drawn that connection between your results and the real world.
And that's a writing thing I wouldn't say is the responsibility of us necessarily to try to translate. I think we as academics collectively can each do a little bit better job of doing that. We don't have to establish some process to make that better. That can just be on us to write more clearly to a different audience.
Let's go to the next question right here. And then Stephanie over here. Okay.
I'd like to hear your thoughts regarding benchmarking in the following sense. Let us suppose that you would assess the value of academic research on a scale of 1 to 10 as a 3. And you said
which one's high and which one's low?
The 1 is low.
Okay.
Do you want me to say -2? Okay. Let's benchmark it at 3 just for this question. And there was a discussion about internal research that you do. Some of you do. And I'm just trying to get at the nature of research itself in the following sense. If you would benchmark academic research as a 3 out of 10, what would you benchmark your internal research as? What number out of 10?
Let me take that a little bit different way. I'm not certain I'm ready to benchmark any particular research as one or the other, or at one end of the spectrum or the other. What we're looking for in standard setting is the best ideas. And it doesn't have to, it can come from any place. So I wouldn't be ready to say internal is better than external or external is better than internal. I think they work together, frankly, and I'm looking for the best ideas. And if we can generate the best idea internally, great, and we can do it very quickly, that's wonderful. If the best idea comes externally, so be it. It doesn't really matter to me whether it's internal or external. That said, back to something Kurt said earlier, the staff can come up with the absolute best research, and I know it's the right answer. When we have to go out in public and defend ourselves, and we do periodically, particularly in Washington, it's going to be discounted pretty heavily. So anything we do internally is discounted. Anything done externally gets a higher nod, gets higher acceptance, unless they don't like the answer, and then it's discounted too.
Just one other thought. Rob Bloomfield talks sometimes about the trade-off between different types of research methods. And so I would say the benchmark sort of depends on your question. Like if you're looking for understanding of how the NYSE population of firms does, then some archival research is going to be better on that particular element. If you're looking for ideas, then the benchmark is going to be maybe not so high. You don't need that necessarily for that. So I think the internal research sometimes accomplishes a different purpose where they're just looking for arguments. And so in that sense, it's comparable with what you can get from academic research. When you need actually hard real-world evidence on some of those issues, that's where the academic research can do better than some of the internal stuff that we do.
Stephanie, did you get? Yeah.
Got it? Yeah. Hi. My question is for all of you, how you use academic research when it comes to really new areas. I mean, for example, Kurt, you talked about segment reporting. Well, you could go back to what happened to the last time it changed, right? But I mean, if we think back to, for example, when stock option expensing happened, how would you approach such an issue today? And I'm thinking, you know, we're in this disruptive economy. We've got, you know, blockchain. We've got cryptocurrency. How do you use academic research when these kind of topics come up? Do you look at other perhaps similar situations and triangulate? What do you do with what we've produced?
So I encourage the staff and the board to try to analogize. I'll just say it's difficult sometimes, especially when the distance between the setting you're looking at and the setting they're interested in is far. Then it's just hard to convince someone on the staff that what you can learn from this analogous setting is not very analogous. But I think that's where you have to start. And you know, in a brand new area that maybe there isn't research yet, and the board's proposing a solution, there's a belief about the world that led them to that solution. And that belief about the world we can just say is a theory. And so let me just find places where we've seen evidence for or against that theory and understand the theory itself. And then we still don't know the question of how the theory is going to work in this new setting, but at least it's a starting point that justifies the path we're on. And as we get more and more data and understand the world a little bit better, we can make the analogy a bit more precise. But that's where I think we start is, what is the belief that's justifying the path we're down? What evidence do we have that justifies that belief?
It's actually one of the reasons why I wanted to get those fair value papers that Ann had mentioned to me, because by analogy, and some have argued that CECL is either fair value light or fair value on steroids, depending on your perspective. Those papers were very instructive, and one of my takeaways from those papers was, by analogy, investors are not, if you tell them answer A is the right answer, if they believe it's something, they're going to look at something else. So it doesn't really matter whether you tell me it's fair value or it's cost or, you know, it's CECL or incurred loss model. They're going to look to what they think the economics are. And I think that kind of overweighs a lot of the other issues about, you know, gosh, it's going to create one problem or another. I think those papers help crystallize the issue that regardless of the accounting, they're going to look to what they think the economics are in fair value in this case. Even if you didn't go down a fair value route, they were going to go fair value. And that was proved over and over again. So, I think the analogy is a really good illustration or example.
But it's a great point. I mean, that's certainly where there is a big demand. You know, like if there was research on kind of like these new accounting standards, right? Obviously, we would be certainly instructive of that, but there's not as much. So we still have to move forward for, I think, a lot of the reasons that we talked about. And that's certainly fine, but I mean, that's kind of where hopefully this conversation is helpful, where if it can shift potentially, or there's a better way to get it earlier in the process, that would be useful. But, you know, lease accounting, for example, was a project that was near and dear to the SEC's heart. And back in 2003, a study was done, and we were uncomfortable as a building that there was all that stuff off balance sheet. So we passed along to the FASB. FASB did a terrific job kind of working the project through, and that's how it became a standard. So certainly, you know, we still get very motivated and kind of work through items, but, you know, again, it's always going to be the information we have. So if the information we have there is not that much in the academic space, you know, we'll certainly move forward, but if it can be bolstered or supplemented, like I said, we're certainly all ears and eyes.
Question is, are you aware of any the hierarchy of academic journals? We have top 3, top 5, not only peer reviewed, but in our academic mind, we have actually hierarchies. The next question is, do you read any academic journals? Not only maybe not in accounting, but any other academic journals or practitioner journals. If we publish our articles in maybe practitioner journals, is that as one channel to reach you instead of, you know, other way to push you, send you email directly?
Oh, okay. So at least I am personally aware of the rankings. This will be a provocative statement. I think your objective should not necessarily, well, it should be to get into the top 5 journals, because that's sort of the ecosystem you live in. I think the higher acknowledgement is you end up in something Hal does or something Sagar does. From a regulatory perspective, if you write a paper that ends up there, that to me is the highest. And I'm not sure if the academic community gives people credit for that, but you're actually influencing real-world behavior in terms of what the regulators and standard setters does. I do like your idea about some of the practitioner and journals, and maybe that's somewhere where you could work with the AICPA and the Journal of Accountancy and getting, having a dedicated section on academic research that's out there as a way to reach into the practice.
I do know that the AAA has been trying over the last several years in particular to try and bridge that gap between what goes into their journals and whether or not it is even read by anybody, by anybody who reads the Wall Street Journal, never mind auditors and accountants. So, the best thing I could say is after you've done your great academic peer-reviewed and gotten it published, write something in plain English and show it in something like the Journal of Accountancy or CFO.com or something like that.
I'm going to answer your question. I'm aware that there is a hierarchy. I don't remember what the hierarchy is. I don't care what the hierarchy is, frankly. And the reason for that, and I do occasionally, I'll go ask Kurt or I'll ask Christine or Tom in the past, just help me think through where does this rank and how will this be received. But I'm kind of testing the boundaries of that particular paper, not that it got published in one or another. And what I'm looking for these, and the reason I don't really care is what I'm really looking for are papers that cause me to think differently, or at least help me think from a different perspective. And again, I put my investor hat back on. I don't want a single analyst telling me their perspective. I want multiple analysts so I can twist and turn and look at it from every single facet possible. And I think that's even more true. It's true as an investor, but I think it's even more true as a standard setter. I want to leave no stone unturned in terms of understanding every perspective possible, so we can ultimately balance the benefits and the cost and all those things that we have to do. And I think that having those papers is really helpful in doing that. So I'm indifferent as to where they come from.
Or would you say that was going to revisit it at this point in time?
No,
Lights went on really
we could talk broader than one specific question, but these issues last a very, very long time, as we all know. People have been trying to solve debt equity for 50 years. FASB currently has a project on it. I know it's not a wholesale project on it to try to improve things. There are certain things that are timeless. Credit losses, how to show it will always be an important issue. So I think there's a continuous, constant need for that information. So it will be looked at. Now, again, it depends on kind of the specific project, where it is, and there's a lot of realities to it. But something that foundational, there will be use for it. Now, would it have been better, to your point earlier? Of course, but we all live in reality, and you don't have the data, it's hard to do the study. But no, I certainly think that on broad, policy type items, there's always a thirst or desire for that information.
I actually think that is important, archival research, but you said 4 years. Why can't it be after 2? And why can't there be a commitment to update it after 4? So you could see the evolution. The reason I think it's important is right now the FASB has, or the FAF has a post-implementation review process. I want to be precise because words matter. But, if you go back in the history of the FASB, I don't know that they've ever come out and said, yep, we got it wrong. I can't remember a single time where they came out and said, we did a standard setting, and at the end of the day, we didn't get it right. They haven't said it. Everyone else might agree with it, but they haven't said it. But if you can inform the post-implementation review process that the FAF goes under, and the reason I sort of, the 4 years is interesting, because they pick it up after 3 years after the private company has adopted. So if you can do post-implementation review work before that and be more timely, I think it'll influence regulators and standard setters. It'll also influence FAF and their post-implementation review.
Following up on the post-implementation, we're always looking at standards that, do they reflect the current environment? In fact, if you look at our mission statement, it's decision useful, information to investors, on and on. But if you look in Sarbanes-Oxley, there's actually a requirement in Sarbanes-Oxley that we consider changes in the business environment and what are the implications for current rules and rules that are being developed. So there's this built-in ongoing requirement. So any research, no matter when it comes out, is helpful because of the ongoing monitoring aspects of what we do. And, as Russ Golden, our chairman, likes to say, our work doesn't stop the day we issue a standard. It just shifts gears to something else, and it becomes monitoring, education, implementation guides, on. And it never really stops. We're always looking at, what do our standards say? How are they being implemented? How are they being applied today? And how will that be affected by changes in the future, whether it's tax law changes, technology changes, and the list goes on and on. So we're always thinking. So regardless of when that type of research is done, and I particularly find it helpful, is always going to be brought into the process of standard setting because it's always a continuous refreshing. Just saying, we never get a standard wrong. It's just the world has changed around us. That's all. I'm sorry, the ones I dissent to, those were wrong. Okay.
So the challenge with post-implementation reviews is that academics have a comparative advantage at thinking about how we can establish causality, whereas a lot of what post-implementation reviews seem to be about in the very short run is, did something change or did something happen? But that's often more of a descriptive question than a causal question. So what I'm curious, and Kurt kind of touched on this issue much earlier, there's really kind of two levels of research, standard setters, and in my limited experience so far on the Australian board, the board is often interested just in understanding what the world looks like before they start to worry about why it looks that way. Is there evidence that would be consistent with a problem? And so I guess one of the challenges is actually getting good quality descriptive evidence, because sometimes, standard setting agencies go out to try and, or seem to go out to try and collect their own information on what the world looks like. And the classic example sometimes is badly designed surveys, where, an academic will look at the survey, and even an academic like probably most people in this room who don't have a comparative advantage at designing good surveys can look at it and go, you can't rely on that. You haven't sort of satisfied even the minimum sort of requirements of how you ensure that a diversity of views is represented if it's really there. That descriptive research is actually an important first step often for standard setters. So I guess the question is how can you do that? Can you engage with academics better to try and get that? But then again, what are the incentives for academics to do that research?
So if I can just comment on that, I'm sort of that view. The questions that I've seen the staff and the board struggle with aren't ones of they want to know like a causal result in a very, very narrow setting. What they're much more interested in is what is the pervasiveness of what things are happening in a broader setting. And I think it's helpful to understand in a narrow setting what happens causally, but ultimately they're going to try to infer about the general population. And so it's not enough to show a causal relationship in a tiny setting to be useful. It's got to go broader than that. Just my experience in sort of observing those conversations. I don't know how to encourage that. Besides, I think there are good studies that get published in good journals that are very descriptive, and maybe it's focusing on the interesting setting and trying to assess, pervasiveness, where we recognize the trade-offs between a more limited, narrow causal setting and a more broad descriptive setting, and that those are complements, and both exist and are useful and helpful.
Thank you. So just on that question, which I think was excellent, and in your response, the problem, of course, often is that we would all love to do causal evidence in the broadest possible setting, right? It's just that these settings often don't come in those forms. And so one of the greatest things that, the SEC has done, for instance, is to introduce some thresholds, and people have done some, interesting work around thresholds, which affords us, but then, for instance, that implies that typically we can say something for firms that are close to the threshold, but not firms that are very far from it. And it's just the nature of it. So my follow-on question is, given that that's a struggle, would the standard setters consider doing more to basically and facilitate that type of research? So either introducing regulations in a more staggered fashion, introducing more thresholds, or perhaps even more radically consider experiments?
I'm probably the only one that's willing to touch this. I think it would be great if they did that. And so I'll give you an example. There's a question right now about whether we should be amortizing goodwill or not. And so the FASB had a standard out there that said, we're not going to impair, we're just going to use an impairment model, we're not going to amortize it. The PCC has pushed back, and I don't think you can use private companies and public companies and draw causation between the two because the incentives are different. So I would love to see, and the former board members in this room are going to freak out when I say this, that you allow an option for 5 years to amortize goodwill, and then go back and say, okay, what happened? Were things better or worse? It's experimenting with the public markets. I get that. But I think it would be great. And I think there's other places that we could do that. I also think your idea about staggering in regulation would be a great idea. I mean, I think we could do more, like CECL would be one where I think we could stagger CECL more in terms of the largest banks go first, then the mid-tier, then the small. And so I would personally be supportive of it. I know that gives some people some consternation, but I think it would be helpful.
I think it's an idea that we have explored in the past, and we have staggered starts for a number of standards today. The pushback that we get when we do this is comparability. Okay, so this group is over here, this group's over here. How do I compare? Now, I'm not a strong believer in comparability, and Tom will, get me on this. He'll tell me that it's comparability by economic phenomena. Is that right? Thank you. I got that one right. See, you did wear off on me. But I think that, quite often we have a group of investors out there that do screenings from top down, and they'll look through and say, okay, give me all companies who have assets of a certain category or a certain type or anything. And if you start getting these groups in different categories, it starts to affect the screening, which then can affect the investment process. So while it's an interesting experiment, there's some real ramifications, and I think that those ramifications are going to be increasingly exacerbated, because as we move to big data in terms of the investor world, and a lot of this is driven because of fee structures, a lot of things going on here, more and more stuff is being done from a screening process or being done by quantitative analysis than it is by good old-fashioned investor picking up a set of financial statements and being able to discern what those differences are. So I think it's worth exploring, but we have to consider, I think, a lot of the cost and the benefits of that type of process.
Can I just jump
Yeah,
in on
sure.
that? So about this idea about experimenting with the markets, I mean, in many ways, you already are experimenting with the markets by making an informed judgment about whether something like amortizing goodwill is good or not. So I think that's maybe not, something to be overly concerned about. In fact, maybe if you're going to experiment, doing it in a sort of methodical way where we can get some causal evidence out of it seems to make a lot of sense.
The other aspect is, where do you draw the line? Who do you experiment on? If you go down a route like that, and if you experiment with the really small players, as a test to see how does it work, because we can get information back more quickly, and they can do it sometimes for less effort than some of the really big players who have massive global systems and processes and everything. But if you play on the other end, the large entities, you're playing with not just one or two entities, you're quite often playing with a substantial portion of the market cap of a particular sector or an industry, and that has its own consequences. So I appreciate the comment. I don't have a good solution at this point, but it's something that, we continue to be challenged on. Why didn't you just phase this in more, or why not just do this for the big players, or, again, credit losses. We hear from the smaller players, we didn't cause the crisis. Right? So why are you making us do CECL? Well, you didn't cause a crisis, but you swim in the same waters, and you will get, and you will, there will be a portion of those smaller entities in the next crisis, the next recession, they'll go under. Will accounting cause that? Probably not. We are coming up on the last few minutes of our time. Are there any other questions that we wanted to get out from the floor? If not, I'm just going to ask the panelists if they want to make any closing comments. I know we didn't follow the script completely here. Sometimes that's an indication that things went pretty well then. We got off and had some good conversations. There was one at the end, if there's any last thoughts you had on relevant questions, if something that keeps you up at night, or anything else that you wanted to touch on that we didn't get to today. Paul? No. Sagar?
It would just be a rehash. So, I mean, I think one thing you may have seen, Wes Bricker, our chief accountant, he has the Bricker Blueprint, right, which tries to lay out, and it's very vast and lengthy, all the different parts of our ecosystem, right, all internationally, domestically, all the different regulators, and kind of the enormity of it. So it's on our website if it's of interest. And then we try to very meaningfully talk to different pieces of that ecosystem, whether preparers, audit committees, auditors, other regulators, academics are of, the point I've been trying to make, are of very high value. And so, to the extent we can continue to have dialogue like this, continue to interact, certainly from our perspective, it would be of high value. Realizing that things may not be perfect, it's still better to get that information. And also realizing that there is a balance, right? Because a lot of these things are decade-long projects, right? Where certainly looking at the data and kind of following your normal process is certainly terrific. So the doors are certainly open in OCA. They are to all kinds of different groups of people. People take advantage, come meet with us, and I would certainly encourage folks here to do so.
I think there's a panel later today on auditing, so I'll leave a lot of that, whatever they're going to talk about, to them, but would encourage academics to make a concerted effort to ground their research in practice if they really want to influence practice, and there's lots of ways to do that. First off is, go to panel sessions where there are practitioners on the panel who are talking about something that's important. Secondly, read comment letters. When new standards are proposed, all of the firms and the CAQ will write comment letters to the PCAOB. Go through those carefully and see what those issues are that the practitioners are raising in terms of how this standard may impact how they could enable what they're going to do should this become the standard. And don't be afraid to ask a practitioner when you see them, particularly the national office people, like don't come up and say, hey, what are the issues you're dealing with? But say, hey, I have this research idea. This is what my question is. Is this something that you guys are struggling with? And get it a little more refined. I mean, there's the Kinney 3 paragraphs and the Libby boxes for a reason. And we see lots of proposals that don't go anywhere near trying to clarify what they're trying to get to in their research. So work on it.
I guess I would just say that if there is an overlap in research that's interesting for standard setters interesting to academics and helpful to standard setters, figuring out what that overlap is sort of responsibility of both parties. Academics, we can produce more relevant research as we understand what standard setters do and regulators do and what they're trying to accomplish. I think standard setters and regulators can better utilize what's out there, analogizing better to other settings, acknowledging that the form of research that we do internally is limited for certain purposes, and there are purposes for which academics are comparatively better able to provide useful evidence. And so I think in the spirit of ecosystem, we all sort of do play in this big world together. And engagement and dialogue back and forth, I think, is helpful for both parties there.
Just one final observation from myself. I came from a world where I, like I said earlier, relied on research, but very honestly, I found 2/3 of it useless. And the other third, it was spoon-fed to me, and I was able to absorb it and use it. I very seldom found, as an investor, academic papers that were particularly helpful to me. So I came to the board with a jaundiced view of academic research. And probably part of it was steered by a sister-in-law who wrote an academic paper, and I couldn't get past the first paragraph. So I think that a lot of this comes down to readability, and I've been educated by the Tom Lensmeyers and the Christine Battisons and the Kurt Gies of the world. You've made it a lot easier for it to be consumed, but it's still, you need to push a little bit harder if you want to have an influence on the process. If you want to get this, your papers read and have some influence, I think you really need to do a little bit more marketing, frankly, of your papers. And we're trying on our end, and I know Kurt, I met with you and Christine and some others, what can we do better internally? And you'll see some of those improvements coming out in the coming year or so, hopefully, or even sooner. So we have a lot to work to do on our end, but I think you've overcome, at least for this board member, you've overcome some really high hurdles in terms of convincing me that academic research has a critical role, not just a good role, a critical role in the standard setting process. So anything we can do to continue to improve that process, I'm all for. So, Mike, you've got a couple of wrap up.
And a kind of provocative discussion. Go ahead and give it a round of applause. And then logistically, we'll have a break now until 10:45. If you could try to be back in your seats right at 10:45, though, we don't have an extra 45 minutes to build into the rest of the panel.